Welcome everyone to our latest Alliance magazine event, Big Bets, Large Unrestricted Multi-Year Funding. My name is Kate Balding, and as features editor, I have the pleasure of moderating today's discussion. For those of you joining us for the first time, these dialogues coincide with the publication of each of our quarterly print magazines, and we hope they serve a welcome opportunity to weigh in on our special feature themes. First, however, a little bit of housekeeping, so please be patient. Today's event will run for approximately 1 hour, with the first part of this dedicated to our panelists and 10 to 15 minutes at the end for our Q&A. If you would like to contribute in the Q&A, and we really hope that you do, you can submit your questions using the chat function or Slido, which you'll find in the panel at the right-hand side of your WebEx window. It should be indicated by a green S. We'll be collecting questions throughout the session, so do feel free to drop those in as you go, and I'll try my very best to get through as many as possible. When you do ask a question, it would also be wonderful if just you could tell us who you are and also where you're from. In addition, for those of you keen to add captions in a preferred language, you can simply click on the little CC icon, which is on the bottom left of your screen. On that note, if you, as an audience member, experience any technical issues, and we really hope that you don't throughout today's event, please just use the chat function to alert a member of the Alliance team, and we'll do our best to assist you promptly, and you can also message us directly. Finally, as an extra bonus for joining today's launch event, we're offering a 20% discount code to anyone who would like to subscribe to Alliance magazine. We're a compendium of news, analysis, and opinion on global philanthropy, and though I'm biased, definitely, and have said it before, it really, really is an amazing hub for those looking to go beyond siloed press releases and actually get to the heart of real philanthropic debate. The link to that will be in the chat shortly, and a recording of today's webinar will be shared with all the attendees after this session. So, with all of that said, it's my privilege to welcome today's panelists. So, first off, we have Gabrielle Fitzgerald, who offers a wealth of experience as the founder and CEO of Panorama Group, a platform for social change spanning philanthropy, politics, and policy. Gabrielle previously served as the Director of Global Program Advocacy at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and I've had the pleasure to get to know her as one of the guest editors for this edition of Alliance magazine, alongside Ashif Sheikh. Joining Gabrielle, we have multi-talented, multilingual Sylvia Ilahuka, who is Communications Officer at the Siegel Family Foundation and co-author of a fantastic article within our June issue. There she is. And last but not least, we have Rebecca Firth, who is Executive Director of the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, who works on with an international team dedicated to humanitarian action and community development. Always a lot of me at the beginning, but we'll change that. But I just want to say welcome to everyone. And to start us off, I would just like to, open and invite the panelists to briefly introduce themselves in their own words, and if they can, to also share where or how they first encountered this concept of big bets, because it can mean a variety of things to different people. And maybe Gabrielle, as guest editor, maybe I'll give you the honor of going first.
Thanks, Kate. Really glad to be here today, and thanks to the Alliance for featuring this important topic in this special issue. So we were really interested in participating as guest editor with Ashif Sheikh from India, as Rebecca just mentioned, because it's a topic that's been in the vernacular for a long time. But at Panorama, we really started paying attention to it around the time Mackenzie Scott made her first gifts, which was just about 6 years ago. And she came out of the gate in such an unprecedented way, giving hundreds of big bet grants, although she didn't use that terminology. And so we really wanted to understand what the impact was going to be on both philanthropy and the organizations who received it. And so through that work, we've talked to hundreds of social change leaders. We've started to understand some patterns, and then we've broadened it to look at other social change initiatives that provide big bet grants, like the Audacious Project, Lever for Change, Co-Impact, and Blue Meridian are some of the biggest ones. So we believe that the sort of terminology has really changed since it was first introduced more than a decade ago. And there's a lot of common lessons to be learned. So I'll be sharing more about that as the webinar goes on. But thanks for having me today.
Fantastic, great introduction. Rebecca, why don't we hop to you next?
Hi, so yeah, I'm Rebecca. I'm the Exec Director of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, otherwise known as HOT. And we are an NGO and community that is mapping unmapped places in the world. I came across the topic of big bets by applying for one, and really had no prior experience of what it was or what it meant before then. And I guess this was also kind of early in the big bet journey, because this was back in 2019. So I led our proposal and was selected for the Audacious project in February 2020. This involved setting the kind of dream vision of mapping an area home to 1 billion people missing from the world map. And we received 32 million over 6 years to do that. And yeah, it's been a very exciting and interesting kind of professional journey. I think before you get a big bet, you think that when you get a big bet, everything's going to get easier. And then you get a big bet and everything gets a lot harder, because there are just so many questions, new ways of working, new things that you and your team have never experienced before. But at the same time, you're also executing on this incredibly motivating vision with resources that you never could have imagined to reach that. And so, you know, there's like serious high highs and also some really tough moments involved in the execution. Thanks so much for having me today.
Great, fantastic to hear from someone who's entered that world from almost the other end of the spectrum. And Sylvia, pass it over to you. Still on mute, Sylvia.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you again so much for having me, Alliance and team, and hello to our audience. So I am the communications officer at Seagull Family Foundation. We are a grant maker working in, I'll say across Africa, with East, Southern, and a couple of Francophone West African countries. And basically what we do is fund visionary local organizations. They're, at different ages and stages, but they come in and for the most part, they stay with us for about 8 years or up to 8 years. And for some in the philanthropy and grant making space, what we do, how we do seems radical. For me personally, I first encountered the concept of big bets through my husband, actually, who was a director at Give Directly for some years. So for those who are unfamiliar with Give Directly, their work's premise is making unconditional cash transfers of a significant size to people living in poverty. So just because people might be short on money doesn't automatically make them short on agency. So the same ethos applies to how Seagull Family Foundation moves in the philanthropy space. Just because organizations are African and local doesn't mean they can't decide how best to use funds. In fact, they are actually better positioned for their proximity. Local leaders know the need, the context, the most appropriate solution, and yet when they're non-Western, there tends to be a shadow of doubt, which then manifests as restrictive grant conditions and other hoops of fire. Yet risk is universal. So believing in local African leaders is the first aspect of how Seagull Family Foundation embodies big bets, and yet the other is the size and flexibility of the grants. Our tickets range anywhere from 10,000 US dollars to the region of 100,000, which thanks to the exchange rate goes a really long way for local African organizations.
Fantastic, yeah,
Yes.
Anything else to add, Sylvia?
No, I was going to say, that's kind of how I came across this. So when this special issue was presented to us, we already had something to say, and I'm really grateful that we got a platform to say it.
No, well, we're really happy to have you, and it's great to hear sort of where everyone's coming from and just get a sense of those initial impressions on the theme. But maybe to just dig a little bit deeper, Gabrielle, I wonder if I could ask you to just share some reflections maybe on guest editing the special feature itself, but also any key points of contention that have really come out of the dialogues that we featured.
Yeah, so it turned out to be a bit of a harder task than I thought it was going to be to both write the cover article and think about guest editing, and I'll share a couple of reasons why. There's been a lot written about big bets, but there's not a standard consensus on what the definition is. People use the term widely now, but it can mean different things to different people. Sometimes it's unrestricted giving, sometimes it's big multi-year gift. And so first even coming up with the standard definition was an interesting challenge. Then there's also been a lot, while there's been a lot written, there hasn't been a ton of long-term research on the impact of big bets. And so we tried to look back on some of the big bet gifts back in around 2001. And we were able to look at some of the results of those gifts now around 20 plus years and understand the impact. And I think a third interesting challenge when we wrote this was that writing the article around the March timeframe, and then there was so much changing, particularly in the US where I'm based, but with USAID, with potential rules on philanthropy changing here in the US, there was so much uncertainty. And one of the sort of assumptions about big bets is that when you get a big bet, it's a key step on the journey to scalability, to sustainability. And then the next step on that journey is often seen as getting government funding. And there's so much flux here in the US in both our domestic and foreign funding and in aid budgets globally, and the ripple effect that has on domestic budgets in lower middle income countries. It made it really hard to think about, what is the future of big bets and what is it where it had always been seen as a stepping stone in the journey, where is it going to be today when the financial landscape has changed so significantly. So those were a few reflections I had after trying to really think about this issue from a big picture perspective. It turned out there's a lot more gray area than perhaps I thought when we started.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Gray areas bad. It's always the unknown unknowns. And maybe I can bring in Sylvia here as one of the contributors to the special feature. I mean, Sylvia, your article was Escaping Groundhog Day. That was the title of it. And it sort of describes philanthropy as stuck in this cycle of disaster and despair sort of reaction. With the slashing of USAID, as Gabrielle said, being the most recent example of this. And you present big bets as one solution for escaping these reactive cycles. And I wonder if you could just share a bit more about that as an idea. Also still on mute, Sylvia, I'm so sorry. Still on mute, Sylvia.
I'm so sorry. For some reason, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. I was saying it seems like a big bet, but to us, it's the idea that we're presenting is actually an ordinary bet in how we do our things, because for Siegel Family Foundation, there was never any difference in perception and trust of African founded and led organizations compared to those led by non-Africans, particularly from the global north or the west or Euro-American. So in the beginning, we did have a number of Africa-based but foreign-led organizations, but that was more a function of that being an easier entry point, given where the Siegel family was coming from and the context that they had. You kind of need to connect with people who you know, and then they lead you into that. So that's kind of how we ended up with our fabulous executive director, Andy Bryant. And then, from then on, the portfolio progressively grew more and more African-led, African-founded, African-based. And to this day, pretty much entirely African-led, founded, and based. And so that's just how we've always operated. So when the idea of localization kind of became the hot topic in the philanthropy space fairly recently, a couple of years ago, we were already on that train. And so when this special issue came up, we are basically just speaking about how we do the things that we do. And the proof is in the pudding, because we've been doing this for over a decade. In the Council on Foundations report, we are ranked second, the largest grant maker by the number of grants, just behind the Gates Foundation. So taking this kind of this idea of like betting big and betting hard on local African organizations, we like to do that because it gives organizations a lot more wingspan to kind of fan out and do what they need to do without worrying about the bread and butter of the day-to-day. That's actually how somebody who I interviewed referred to it in one of our previous articles about multi-year grant operating dollars, aka My God. And she said, My God is the bread and butter that allowed you to keep going while chasing for other bigger opportunities and other, projects. You still need to be able to keep the lights on at home and to eat, organizationally speaking. So yeah, that's really the gist of what we're going for in our contribution.
I think it's quite interesting from like different perspectives that I've heard from different authors in the magazine. It seems like there are sometimes two opposing ways of presenting big bets. So for some people, it is presented as a necessity to help people keep the lights on, weather external storms, increase organizational capacity, and kind of this not very sexy perhaps, but like base level sustenance. And then on the other side, we have people who are really pushing how big bets are such a driving force of innovation, and they allow nonprofits to dream big and come up with solutions that we've never come up with kind of before. And this kind of just aside, I guess, but I'd be interested to know each of you whether you find one side or the other more compelling an argument for presenting big bets to those who aren't convinced by it or interested in it, perhaps. I don't know if anyone has feelings on that. Maybe I'll start with you, Gabrielle. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to share what we learned from our interviews with several hundred leaders who had received these big bet gifts. And what we found was that most of the time there was kind of joy and shock when they were first awarded. And then there was kind of sometimes from the staff and the board, there was a lot of expectations about what could be done. And so then there was a level setting process about, okay, what can we really do with this money? And what we heard then pretty consistently was that people would make some quick investments in things that were long overdue, like systems upgrades, sometimes hiring fundraising staff, bringing on new technology. But then the balance of the money went in one of two directions. The first was creating an endowment or a rainy day fund so that people had that, which in many cases they didn't. Or the second was that people could go deeper or broader in a program. But what we heard time after time was if you did that, you had to be very careful about your planning because you couldn't count on another year, another big bet. A lot of them, like Mackenzie Scott, I believe the Audacious Project, say this is a one-time gift. And so it's designed, you need to design your spending of it so that it scales over time. And so it was actually quite different than what we thought, that it was going to be this huge catalyst for change. And most of the leaders really used it to make incremental change and to grow in a careful and steady state way. So they didn't get out ahead of themselves and put themselves on a financial cliff that they couldn't keep up when that multi-year gift ended.
Did either of Sylvia or Rebecca, do you have extra thoughts on that? Sylvia, microphone, so sorry.
Sorry, I was saying I can let Rebecca go first.
Thanks, Sylvia. I was going to say, I see a huge difference between a big bet and a windfall. So I view it like a windfall as like a big cash injection, but that does not have like a particular activity associated to it. And with that, you can build an endowment, strengthen your internal processes, do the kind of that work that isn't the kind of sexy external, hey, we're going to hit this big thing, but like your organization will be fundamentally stronger, versus a big bet, which in my experience is like a large fund that is associated to achieving a particular thing, which means there's less of that money that you can spend on kind of your organizational sustainability. So I feel like the kind of the sort of fiscal cliff experience in a big bet is quite a present one in comparison to a windfall, though there are definitely ways you can manage it. But I do think the two of them, that question of expectations of all of your stakeholders, from your staff to your donors to your partners, is a really critical one on both sides, because when you launch like a multi-year plan, you think you know what you're going to do and you think you have a lot of detail behind it, and then you launch it and you find out that like, whoa, there are like just thousands of questions that you had never imagined. You did your level best to get everything prepped in advance, but people are going to have questions that you didn't imagine, and people's expectations are going to be set from that moment of launch around what you're going to do. And I think one thing that I have noticed in myself and other kind of big bet recipients is you're working with a different type of capital to what you've been trusted with previously, which means that it's actually you that has to set the boundaries and the guardrails and the restrictions on how that is used, in a way where our previous funding, the fund dictated that. And so there wasn't like much up for grabs in how staff design a program or what decision our leadership team makes, because all that funding was so restricted that there was no room for that, for your team to have that kind of creativity in that dance, and actually building behaviors to work in that way is a new thing if you haven't had that kind of funding before. And yeah, for me was a kind of a huge part of the learning how to do that effectively, whilst also scaling and bringing in new people.
Great. And Sylvia, did you want to come in with some final thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I do, and I would actually like to build on something that Anna has written in the Q&A chat box. She says, big bets are great, and we try to apply for those that make sense, but they take so much work to apply to. Are they really worth it, considering only a few end up being funded? And I really want to address that, because there are two things going on here. The first thing is there are different types of funders and different types of grants and how they administer those grants. I imagine from what Anna is describing, she might be thinking of the larger institutional grants, or things that are more competitive, let's say, in their application process, in which case, you're casting your bid and hoping you get picked. So that's one thing. But then you have other funders. So for example, Seagull Family Foundation, the way we do it, by the time you're filling out an application, you've been invited to apply. So it's no longer a competition at that point. The harder part might be, getting into the ear of someone who can actually get this organization in line for a site visit and some due diligence and whatnot. So there's sort of different entryways. And for those funders for whom it's, and after the fact, like, okay, now go through here's an application to fill out. Before that, there was a personal relationship that had been cultivated, or some type of contact. I think I would like for us to not forget the importance of human connection in the funding process, because there's this idea that, well, it's easy to forget that funders are also people. And they're human beings, they get tired, they get overwhelmed. I'm on the communication side, and the number of emails that we get from hopefuls is quite a lot. And understandably so. Everybody wants to be bet on. Everybody wants to have their org or their dream have a chance to grow and thrive and be funded. And so it's great that the desire is there, but there are sort of realistic limitations on how that can be approached. That being said, I do hear the frustration of filling out applications, submitting proposal, only to find out that there was something hidden in the fine print that excluded you. Unrestricted grants just like they don't mean irresponsible grants. Like, having multi-year grant operating dollars doesn't negate the necessity for due diligence. And on our part, for example, like we found fraud that made it necessary to break off a funding relationship, and that was written into the grant terms because it is important to set boundaries. I think there's this unfortunate idea that unrestricted multi-year grant operating dollars sound like it's a free-for-all, woo, money raining party, and you don't need to account for it. And that's actually quite incorrect. You do have to have parameters, you do have to be sensible, but you also need to leave room to breathe, so as to not stifle the implementing organizations who are so busy doing the work that they need this money to do. So they can't be spending hour after hour filling out M&E report and this and that takes away from the actual work. So we try to keep it light in the way we do it. We want to know if you're doing what you said you were going to do and meeting your goals, but at the same time, have it be non-burdensome.
Yeah, fantastic. Some really good reflections there. And maybe it's a good time to turn to you, Rebecca, as well, just using your recipient lens, perhaps, and just hearing about like your take, I guess, on those rewards and challenges associated with big bets. And particularly, I think I'd like to touch on using that for long-term change as well, and not just the money drop, quick reactive, but how can it be actually used for sustained long-term impact?
Amazing. Okay. Gosh, I feel like I need to summarize 5 years of my life in 5 minutes. But we're now in year 5 of 6 on a big bet, so very much done the bulk of the execution and looking at that kind of what's next moment. So this is obviously a very pertinent question and time for me. So we're about to hit our target, which was to map an area home to 1 billion people, which is incredible. In terms of the reward for the reward for doing a big bet, it's that like in the 10 years before a big bet, we achieved 15% of that goal in 10 years. And in the 5 years since, we've achieved 85% of it. So that's 5-6 times more impact in half the time. And that is the reward of the big bet. I do think there is another layer to that, right? We're all social impact leaders. We're all going to care first and foremost about our social impact. It's the piece of like, the big bet allowed us to design our organization the way our community and the work we wanted to do was kind of laid out. So we were quite a small team before. We grew our team a lot and we very, very rapidly decentralized it. So we have now about 75 staff in 35 countries, but we're serving an area home to 1 billion people. Like, how can you be close to 1 billion people? Nobody can do that. The only way you can do that is by spreading your team as wide as you possibly can in that area. So I think what like the big bet enabled us was to go through the HR nightmare that is having a structure like that. Like I all the time, I think there must be organizations with like 10,000 staff in one country that are simpler than our 70-person team across 35 countries. So we decentralized very rapidly into 4 regional hubs, and almost all of our work happens via those hubs, apart from the technology we provide, which comes from our tech team. And yeah, it really enabled us to kind of I think without a big bet, it would have taken us a very, very long time to reach that level of decentralization and that level of regional leadership. It would have been like 2 years per hub to try to slowly set that up. I think there's also another reward around staff stability. Like, every human does their best work when they're not worried and they're not like fighting for that next grant or contract. And so I feel like it really freed up our teams to bring the creativity that they have and the understanding of the actual root causes of the problems they're experiencing in their communities to their program design, rather than the kind of quick band-aid show impact in 12 months types of programs. But of course, the challenges are many, right? Because there aren't that many. Like, my big bet started in 2019 and 2020, well, launched in 2020, and immediately we were totally isolated. So I had basically no peers. I didn't know anybody else who had run a big bet. and I was running one alone and scaling an organization without being able to meet any of the people that I was scaling it with. So like really in that space of like having to like trust people that you haven't been able to build trust with yet. And it was really challenging. And at that time I thought like, oh, COVID is this special moment. And now have realized that I think in any time frame of a big bet, you need to plan for 2 crises to happen. Like the world has just so many crises happening over and over. We've had 2 in ours with the COVID and then the US aid situation. And I think like when you're working on that kind of time frame, you just need to be aware that there are going to be like a lot of unpredictable and like major shocks during that time. And I think the other thing I would say is like, I personally have heard a lot of people talk about like a big bet helps you to stop fundraising for a period and lets you free up and focus on the work. And I believe that is a total myth. I have not seen a big bet that did not involve scaling in a way that did not need to be sustained unless it was a pure project. If it's a pure project to like do a thing and then stop, maybe that is the case. But if it's an investment in your organization and your organization mission, that work does not end. And even though you've mapped an area home to 1 billion people, your work has not finished. There are going to be disasters in that area all the time that are going to change the landscape. There's so much more work that you can do that's going to be way more impactful now you have that baseline. Like, it's not true that you just like do it and end. And so you really need to focus on defining your end state business model during your application from the beginning. And I believe with at least 2 revenue categories, because that way you are going to be more resilient at scale to shifts within those revenue categories. And it's something I feel like quite passionate about, because I do see a lot of people talking about like the benefit of the big bet is no longer having to worry about finances. And everybody I know who's executing on big bet is more worried about finances than ever, because they have scaled this incredible organization in a really efficient and effective way, and they want to keep it going. And that's really important. And then I guess the last thing I would add is like, I think a big bet, like typically they are given to systems change organizations, and they give you that moment where you can then focus on systems change rather than rapid results. But you still have to design evaluations that will show you impact before, like a year before the end of your grant, so that you have that to leverage in your next step. You have that to design the next, you have the learnings to design your next step, and you have the evidence to motivate the funding for your next step. And I think that can like, actually that time ticks quicker than people realize in the challenge. Like it takes you a year to scale up your organization. You're then only really executing for 2 years before you immediately need the results to be able to work with moving forward. So it's much shorter than that 5-year time frame makes you think, which I would also kind of add, because I think the kind of execution experience can just be very different from when you see on paper 5 years. It's actually 2 years that you really need to do that on. Anyway, those are some starting thoughts, but interested to hear from other panelists or other attendees if those are things they've experienced in a similar way, in a different way, and see where we go from there.
Yeah, Sylvia or Gabrielle, do you have any feedback on that one?
Happy to just build on the point on fundraising briefly and then turn it over to Sylvia. Just to really concur with what Rebecca said, there is this myth that it means you're done fundraising. And what we've heard from our conversations is I'm going to use rough numbers, maybe 1/3 of the groups, they were really able to leverage the big bet gift and bring in more donors and use it as a way to make the case that they needed more funding. But I would say for the majority of the organizations, they had to do a lot of work to help their donor base be educated about, no, everything's not all set now. They need the smaller donations to keep coming in. They need new funders to keep coming in. And exactly to Rebecca's point, you want to scale and grow, and you don't want to go back to where you were before the big bet. So I think there's a lot of education needed of your donor base if you're an organization that does receive a big bad gift. And my organization, Panorama, has developed a playbook based on everything we've heard from these conversations. And as we update it and revise it with things that we learn, I think that's something we're going to make even more strong in the next version, to say, you have to think about fundraising from day one, from how you inform your existing donors to how you position the announcement of your gift for future donors.
Yeah, great. And Sylvia.
So, kind of also building on what was just said, there is a question about parameters for the unrestricted grants and what kind of parameters those might be. This ties in directly to what you're saying about big bets, because in our case, our parameters are actually less in the hard numbers and more in the qualities. So these are things that are evaluated at the beginning, such that once an organization is in, it's good and can be trusted, so to speak. However, the organization does still need to set milestones in collaboration, in partnership with the program officer who is assigned, and work to meet those milestones along the way. So they're self-determined, with some pushing here and there and some encouraging from the program officers and some nudging to really help with growth. And that needs to be maintained over time. And then of course there's some common sense things built in there, like don't do fraud and things like that. Once you have that, I think it shifts the thinking away from parameters or due diligence needing to be locked specifically in like hard numbers, like you must have served this number of people by this date and whatnot, determined by the donor. The donor is actually not really in a position to necessarily have all the information that would inform what would a good number of people reached look like? What are the obstacles that we are up against as we're trying to do this work? And taking all of that into consideration, instead of looking at a binary black and white picture of what success, growth, scaling may look like for a local African organization. There's also a need for the funding organizations to regard recipients less as grantees and more as partners. Like it corrects the often skewed dynamic of top-down funding, like a downward gradient from the global north to the global south. But a partnership says, like, we're doing this together. You drive the car, I will help you put in fuel. And it continues going that way, and it ends up being more fruitful in the long term.
Yeah, thanks so much. Some really pertinent, absolutely great advice there. And let's just glance at the time. I might just ask the panelists to share a final remark before we move on to the Q&A section of today. And namely, this special feature, we hear a lot of quite vocal minority voices essentially advocating for greater distribution of big bets, how important they are, and I think mirroring a lot of the things that we've said in the call so far. But I think there is quite a quiet majority that we probably need to address, who are still hesitant, dare I say even skeptical, about large unrestricted multi-year funding. And I guess my question is, what would each of you say to these individuals, and how would you convince them, remembering that funders are humans, as was raised, how would you convince them to broaden their practices? Rebecca, I'm going to pick on you to go first, if that's okay.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think in 2024, it was 26% of all fundraising dollars were big bets. So it's clearly like an innovative growth area that a lot of people are considering and moving into. I think I feel two things on that question. The first one is to see what the organizations who've had one have achieved. Like, I think a lot of those organizations have received investments that have made them much more efficient, and that makes this a wonderful time to double down on them. Your dollars will go further with that. And I think it's like, is that your incentive? Like, do you want to find support and pathways for organizations that have reached this kind of more impactful stage, or do you want to help other organizations get into that? I would recommend, like, whichever your goal is, like building dialogue around what you're skeptical on with the people that you are considering. So like our donors who, as you are humans, are also incredibly smart and engaged, and they do have concerns, but that hasn't stopped them acting, and that's something I really admire. Like, I really admire how they've had tough conversations with us in public, in small group settings, about these kind of key challenges, and like, how do you manage these kind of the ripple effects or the dynamics that a big bet can introduce. And I think kind of the fact that they have brought that to the table has also allowed us and the other recipients to be candid, to be honest about the experience we're having, that it's not all perfect. Like, yes, you have this amazing impact, but the implementation is really hard, and it helps you be honest about that, which is kind of how you improve. And yeah, we are very fortunate to have some donors that are real kind of thought leaders in that space around how to do big bets better. And I think there's a lot that that people can do from having that dialogue in public, even if it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, definitely. Fully agree with that. Sylvia, maybe I'll jump to you next.
Yes. So my final parting words would be that existing and thriving in philanthropy is being willing to learn as you go, to get it wrong, find out, know better, do better. And when you know better and you're doing better, you tell your friends. So we have an advisory service through our equitable giving team to share what we know with our peers and private individuals who want to give in a big bets way. And we also share due diligence about our grantee partners, because gatekeeping is a really unhelpful and actually dangerous thing in the philanthropy universe, both on the parts of the donors, if you know something about an organization, to like not give a heads up to a peer funder, or to not want to share, because the idea is, oh, I've put in all this work doing due diligence, how can I just give it away? But it's actually to the benefit of both parties. And then on the implementing organization side, the gatekeeping manifests as one organization maybe not wanting to share a connection or make an introduction to a funder, because there's this fear that, oh, there's a limited pool of funds. Then if I tell you about this funder, then you're going to go and take money that come to me. And so sometimes you have that very unhelpful gatekeeping. And yet, if there was collaboration on all fronts, we've seen really beautiful coalitions grow out of some of our grantee partners, because they were willing to talk to each other and bring each other into the circle. And we saw this during COVID. A couple of coalitions rose up in Malawi. We saw this during the instability in Burundi in 2016. There were some coalitions that arose there. In Uganda, we have a really thriving coalition of healthcare organizations and others that are kind of in the social impact space, and they just get together and they do their own thing, and it sometimes helps them score larger tranches of money, which could then go and really be more impactful on the ground. It makes it more effective when you're implementing, especially in those spaces where organizations are filling a gap for the government, kind of covering or some missing service delivery aspects. And so, when they work together, it becomes more effective. Yeah, we really saw this during COVID, when everybody was overwhelmed and struggling. And we had these incredible groups that just banded together and really brought services to the people. Yeah, so I'm all for unrestricted funding for local orgs. I'm all for having a relationship with the organizations that are being funded. Let it be a living thing, because if it's just this one-way street of money leaving a place and going somewhere and doing something, but it not really like coming back to be allowed to grow and flourish further. And yeah, that's that's really all I have for right now. Thank you.
Great, and then we'll end with Gabrielle before going on to our Q&A. What would you say to those skeptics?
Well, one thing that we pointed out in the article was that there's a misperception from donors that managing big bet gifts is very hard for nonprofit organizations. And when nonprofit leaders are surveyed, they're very comfortable managing big bet gifts. So I think one of the things that's really important is to educate people that most leaders are not overwhelmed when a big bet grant comes in. They have the staff and the board usually to help sort through that. There have been a couple of high-profile failures, and I think those inform that it's difficult for nonprofits to manage, but again, it's the exception rather than the rule. The second thing I'll call out from the article, just to reinforce Sylvia's point, my co-editor, Ashish Sheikh of People's Courage International, really wanted to drive home the point that many of the existing big competitions or grant making go to organizations that are predominantly English speaking in the developed world, and it's harder for organizations in non-English speaking countries, smaller organizations, to access the kind of big bet dollars. And so he really wanted to encourage funders to take a broader look at this type of organizations that could benefit from that type of giving. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, definitely. In fact, that will sort of lead into having a glance through some of the comments, but I think we'll come back to that topic. But we'll now kind of, segue into this Q&A section of the event. And a reminder, I guess, to everybody joining us online that if you would like to pitch a question to the panel, please do use the Q&A function in Slido. So you'll see the icon with the green S, and do include your name and where you are joining us from. So just to kick things off, the first question we have actually came in over email, and it's from Sarita Ranchod. And I think the question just mirrors the one from Charlotte Massey, who has just posted in the chat, and it is the following. They say, I'm still not convinced about how the status quo is actually changed by current big bet philanthropy, and the role of entities with outsized power to influence concerns me. How do we shift power meaningfully rather than just fiddling at the margins? And where does diversity, equity, and inclusion fit into big bet grant making? I don't know if anyone wants to start us off with that one.
I'm happy to talk about some ways we kind of address that in our implementation. And so, as I said, like our goal was to map an area home to 1 billion people and build the community in local countries that would sustain and continue to do that mapping. And our next wave includes supporting them all as local organizations to build their livelihoods from mapping. So with all the kind of data and drone experience, talent that we've built in those countries over the last 5 years, we now want to help them all be like locally embedded organizations providing a new product to the local market. At the moment, in many countries, you can't procure those services locally. You have to buy them from the US or Europe at a price point that local actors can't afford. So there were two things we had to do to get to there. One of them was the decentralization in our entire model, like all of our staff, all of our processes, all of our funds. Like I always have this, like my belief in like when people talk about power is like, just look at where the money is and that will tell you. Like power is money at the end of the day. You can't say like that you're decentralizing power if you're not also decentralizing money. So that we had to do that within our organization and also beyond our organization. So how do we take an approach of like the rising tide raises all ships? We are part of an open source movement to map the world. The other movers in that movement need to also see money. So this meant a lot of money of our grant was in no way absorbed by our organization. And that is really hard, right? Because when you hit like crazy inflation or like a civil war makes working in a particular area so much more expensive than it was, like you really have to fight really hard to make sure that you're still kind of maintaining those principles and decentralizing cash where you can. And I think that's a really important part that a lot of people miss. Like we did a lot of scaling through partners. We didn't scale our team. We needed this. If this is a win for HOT, it has to be a win for other organizations like us in order for the system to be stronger in the long run. And we did a lot of like considering ourselves as like a node in a network and how do we play a responsible role as a bigger node in that network rather than, oh great, we've won now with this big bet and now we're going to ace it. It was like, how do we be a responsible member of this community when we are fortunate to have resources that others don't? And for us, a big part of that answer was sharing those resources. And yeah, that can be hard. Like some of the potential donors up front, I think, had a lot of questions about the other organizations that were going to receive funding and how like we were going to manage relationships with them. But ultimately, we're also able to see why we were doing that and why that was like an important and unique part of our model in terms of building an open source movement.
Yeah, I mean, just to open this one quickly, because I think it's an important question. Sylvia, Gabrielle, did you have any other thoughts about like how big bets can better work on the diversity, equity, inclusion question? Sylvia, your mic's off, so I'll come to you.
It's tough because I had an answer ready and now I feel like I need to tweak it slightly.
You can
I
always
think I
go.
will add on to what I was saying earlier because I realized I didn't complete my train of thought when I was answering the question about the parameters that we set in unrestricted grants. I did say that the it was not so much in hard and fast figures and more in the qualities of an organization, but I didn't elaborate on what I meant by qualities. It's basically what, like, does the organization, how do I say this? Like their profile, like are they proximate to those who are being served? Are they up for social benefits? Are they, at what stage are they in their growth? Legal status is a really important thing. Do they have a vision? What's their reputation? Their strategic fit? Like, do they line up with the sort of things that we want to be working towards? How are they about learning? Stability. So those type of qualities are what would inform the type of organization that makes it into the portfolio. And then thereafter, once they're in there, they have the freedom to do what they need to do while still adhering to milestones that they set for themselves. I hope that paints a more complete picture and also ties in to the previous answers that were shared.
Great, thanks. Gabrielle, unless you have something else to add there, I will maybe just jump on to the next question if that's okay. Yeah. And this one's actually for you, Gabrielle. It's from Ellen Marson, and they ask, Gabrielle, have you heard from big bet funders if they are broadly satisfied with the ways awardees are spending their award funds? So I guess that might be reference to the data there.
So a couple of different ways to answer that. I don't know that I have an answer to the exact question. I think what we've seen is these big bet funding mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, Audacious, Co-Impact, Blue Meridian, Lever for Change, is they continue to attract new donors. And so to me, that's very exciting because it means that donors are buying into the idea that this is collaborative. Funding is a good way to make grants, and investing with partners in making big gifts to organizations is a good way to go. So that's one answer to the question. The other answer to the question is, I think that, we haven't really heard of any of the big bet funders saying we're turning away from this because it's not working. But we have heard other funders who have a degree of skepticism. That's what I mentioned earlier. And I think based on everything we've heard in our research and conversations is that skepticism is really unwarranted, that most of the organizations have really been able to grow with the big bet funding they've received.
Great, and I think that also touches on Rick's question there. One from Ruby Tobajan. So this one's actually for the funding. So this is Sylvia and Gabrielle. And the question is, could you give an example of what effective co-development has looked like? And in fact, Rebecca, you might be able to come in on this as well, kind of on what co-development has looked like for you. But does anyone like to take a lead on this one? So what an example of effective co-development and what that's looked like.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please? Effective?
No problem. Could you give an example of what effective co-development has looked like? So I guess that might be to do with co-development between a funding body and a recipient organization in terms of managing a big bet.
Oh, I see. Okay. I actually want to start with something that was asked briefly in the questions about a big bet, sort of like the way SFF funds not qualifying as a big bet because it's a small ticket size. And I think if we start by taking that out of the way, it will be easier to answer the rest of the question. So a big bet for us in our case is less about the money and more about the trust behind the grant and how it's set up. So 10K might seem like a small amount, especially in the private philanthropy standards. But when you think about the heart behind it, when you think about if like the willingness to believe in what an organization is doing, the willingness to have a sustained relationship with them, all of that is still a big bet because we're dealing with a continent that for the longest time has been regarded with a lot of skepticism and mistrust and prejudice and assumptions about use of money and trustworthiness. And all of these are rooted in other unpleasant stereotypes relating to the unfortunate dynamics of this world. But we do live in that space, and you do have to take that in account. So choosing to say, no, that's not how I'm looking at this. I believe in this small organization somewhere that sometimes doesn't even have a website, but what they're doing is what matters more. Somebody else asked sort of what has changed since we started doing big bets and like what we're expecting from the grantees. And for us, in the case of Siegel Family Foundation, nothing has changed because we've always given big bets by our standards, the big bets like that. Barry Siegel would get on a plane, go to a country he had never been to before, get on a minivan, go to a village, and write a check for $5,000. The amount is tiny, by standards, but look at the heart behind it. Look at the willingness to go that far and say, I believe in what you're doing. That is what makes it a big bet for us.
Yeah, great. Does anyone else want to jump in on that, or shall I pop on to the next question? Got lots coming through, so let's press on. So this one actually also comes in from Alison Hillman, and actually it's addressed to you, Sylvia. Sylvia, you mentioned that a personal connection with POs must be cultivated. Do you have advice about how to get an introduction to a prospective donor to be able to begin cultivating that relationship? A great practical question. I think lots of people will be interested in the answer.
That is a great practical question. So it depends on where the organization is in terms of pre-existing relationships. If you're completely new to the playing field and you don't know anybody, that requires you to kind of find a buddy in the space. So for an organization that's really doing good work, but they're still small and haven't had a chance to be funded by larger orgs, I would say there are two paths to that. One is if the organization is active in their sector, in the area that they're working with, to get to know other orgs that are working there and say, hey, who's funding you? How did you get an intro to them? And hopefully they are forthcoming and not falling into that gatekeeping that I was talking about earlier. That is the first kind of stepping stone to being able to connect, to being able to talk about your work and share, and then eventually, one thing leads to another. The other side of it is seeking out incubators and spaces where smaller organizations are welcome and get to congregate in a way that they're then connected with larger funding bodies. So for example, we have our social impact incubator, which we are currently launching the West Africa version for very soon. We're currently receiving applications from organizations in Francophone West Africa that are still too small for traditional funding from larger bodies, but are still doing something really great and with a little bit of guidance could get to a place where they now qualify for direct funding. So we have this incubator. Hopefully we can get other funders on board to support this. And we've done this before in Burundi, we've had Booster Kenya, we've had SII, Social Impact Incubator in Tanzania. And some of the organizations that have graduated from that entered the Siegel portfolio and then went on to even other bigger funders. So I would encourage a smaller organization to try and do that. Once they're in, if that organization has a program officer who is proximate, who understands the context and is willing to have a relationship with the organizations, which I think is very important, then that also opens the doors. It's just by staying in touch and communication. And if they have a cool comms team like we do, tell us about what you're doing. And that also, those highlights really help. That's all.
Great, and I'm aware we're coming into the last minute, but I might just ask for a one-sentence answer from all of you from this question from Rick, which just says, how can we get more funders to adopt this kind of funding model? So nice and simple to the point. Maybe Gabrielle, I'll come to you first, if that's okay.
Well, Rick, we definitely agree with you. We have found through our research that this is a very successful model for funding, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to co-edit this special issue and why we've published the various documents we've published to try and bring that evidence base to support that this has really strengthened a lot of organizations to do really impressive work. So I don't know that that's going to convince anyone right now, but that is something we're working toward.
Great. Rebecca, maybe I'll ask you next.
I mean, your question was how. I think we've seen the impact. We talk about what it enables. For me, like that, the most effective way of how is going to be shoulder tapping. It's going to be funders that do big bets, shoulder tapping other funders that could, and talking about why they do it, what they see as the advantages, what have been the challenges in their journey, because that kind of talking to a human who is actually doing it is always going to be more effective. So that would be my suggestion for any big bettors on the call. Then please do your shoulder tapping. And if you are not a big better but considering being, then reach out to a funder who is and ask about their experience.
Great. And Sylvia, finish us off.
Yes, so I would actually like to answer the question about the crowding out effect of big bet grants just really quickly. The asker says, often I have seen how alliances weaken due to some orgs winning grants and others not within the same alliance, like others not getting it. And I just wanted to say that if alliances are weakening because of that, then their priorities were off to begin with. Because if the organization's goal is the work, if the focus is the people, who wins what would weigh less than the fact that the money is in the wider pool and will still benefit the space. So you win money from here, I bring money from there, we're still doing our own individual work, but impacting the same pool of people because we have a common shared interest. And that should really be the focus. But if the focus is going to be, oh, like you scored a fund, a big grant from this foundation, or like you won this really coveted prize, and then that leads to weakening of alliances, that's deeply unfortunate, and it's something that organizations should be really mindful of.
Great, fantastic. And yeah, with that, apologies everyone for a few minutes over, but we have reached the end of this afternoon session on large unrestricted multi-year funding. Gabrielle, Sylvia, Rebecca, sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I just say thank you for your generous and generative conversation today. Also Jody and the Alliance team, thank you for all of your support behind the scenes. And of course to all the contributors and indeed audience members for continuing to support dialogue across the sector. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.